Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm also a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me on the podcast is my old friend, Dario Fabbri. Dario is the director of the monthly Domino in Italy. He's an Italian geopolitical analyst, one of the best Italian geopolitical analysts that there is in the business, and a good friend, I'm happy to call him. We've been trying to get Dario on the podcast for a couple of months, but he's been so busy that he hasn't been able to make time, but we're super appreciative of him coming on now and giving us a perspective on Rome, on what's going on in Italy, Italy's view of the EU, and the rest of the world. So thanks to Dario for making some time to come on the podcast. We recorded on January 11th. This will probably come out in about a week or so. There's nothing too time sensitive on this, but if you see any big gaps, that's why. And if anything breaks in the next couple days, we'll publish it early. Otherwise, write to me at jacob@cognitive.investments if you have any comments about the podcast or about what CI does. Cheers. See you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. Dario, we've been trying to do this for a couple months now. It's so nice to have you back on the podcast.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure sharing some thoughts with you and even hang out with you. So I'm glad to be here.
Did you get any votes for the leadership in the last Italian election? I know in the one previous that apparently somebody threw your hat into the ring.
No. Unfortunately not, but I didn't deserve any votes, so it's better that I didn't get any. It's okay. But no, I didn't get any vote this time.
I guess that's fine, although who deserves the votes? I don't know. So the first thing I wanted to ask you is, has anything changed with Meloni in power from sort of your perspective, either at a domestic level, at sort of an Italian geopolitical level? I was reading before we got on the podcast today that apparently the decision for Italy to supply Ukraine with arms and weapons and things like that has been delayed a month. I wonder if that has to do with sort of backroom negotiations. Just tell me from an Italian's perspective, because a lot has been made of Meloni in the Western press and in the English press about, far right this and conservative that. So I thought I'd try and get the ground truth from you and tell me what's going on there from your perspective.
Well, yeah, she's far right, of course. It's not something that has been made up, but it's the truth. Domestically, it's really too early to say if anything has changed so far, and I don't think has. Mostly her government has been focusing on identity, trying to build up their electorate with some measures that you can easily attach to law and order, so to speak. But especially when it comes to migrants or when it comes to crime or even rave parties, here we spend a couple of months discussing a law on rave parties. Because this government won't ban those parties, illegal parties. I mean, so anyways.
What kind of parties are these? I don't quite understand what that is.
Human techno parties.
I see.
Music.
I got it.
And sometimes, they were sort of a gathering with many youngsters coming from all over Europe to those parties, and of course they're illegal. They tend to take place in a wasteland around the country, but we're talking seriously 3-4 a year. But anyways, the justice say that domestically here the government has been focusing mostly on identity measures. They were called so here, and when it comes to foreign policy, nothing has really changed on that front either. And I'm trying to explain why. Well, something has changed, but not that much, to be more precise. I think this government wants to work around two relationships overall. Those are the one with France and the one with Germany. Mm-hmm. The problem here is that, at least so far, it looks like this government wants to rebuild those relationships at once, simultaneously. And also considering that the way that he wants to revisit those relationships is a controversial and even an aggressive one. It gets complicated. I will try to be clearer about this. The government doesn't want, of course, Germany to get back to austerity. Because if Germany does, of course, the European Commission will follow suit, to be very, very honest. And that would be very bad for Italy, but also for France. And that's the main reason why we tend to get close to France when it comes to fiscal issues. But also, our government wants to rework the relationship with France, especially when it comes to managing migrants in the Mediterranean Sea, and even more importantly, when it comes to the sphere of influence in Northern Africa and Western Africa, where, of course, France is usually the most important country, a European country. I mean, of course, then you have Turkey, you have China, but that's another league. And Italy is trying to sort of carve a room for itself on that front. Not because usually Italy doesn't really follow strategy, just because we want to manage better the migrant issue. Public opinion in Italy is very sensitive, not only here, of course, but here especially when it comes to migrants. And this government has built an image for itself as very tough towards migrants. So they think that trying to show themselves strict and tough on that issue, even towards France, by portraying France as a sort of a country that leaves the whole burden to us, doesn't really want to intervene, but it leaves the whole issue to us. That will work with our public opinion. On that front, France didn't like that at all. I don't know if you followed this part here. The issue here was a couple of months ago when Rome and Paris they bickered on this issue. There was this NGO ship that had saved migrants in the Mediterranean Sea, and they wanted to go to an Italian port, but our government said no. We said you should go to France, and Paris said no. The Dublin Convention states that they were supposed to go to the nearest port, and that would be Italy. So there was this bickering, this going back and forth, this fighting that went, of course, then reached the governments. But that, besides the specific issue, what it told us is that Paris doesn't really want Italy to change the relationship with them, even beyond migrants. France considers us, to be very honest, a junior partner. They wanted us to get to Western Africa to help them now that they're withdrawing their soldiers, their military from Western Africa. But they do not want us, of course, to set the agenda. And the migrant, unfortunately, that's very unfortunate, but the migrants just, they got in the middle of it with those two governments, of course, fighting for something else. So, and I'll stop here. I'll get back to you. So far, when it comes to foreign policy in Europe, then if you want, we can talk about our foreign policy towards Ukraine. Of course, that's Europe, but it involves Russia and the US. That's something different. When it comes to France and Germany, of course, those are the most important relationships for Italy. This government wants to change things with both government, but I don't think it will. It's not a matter of being able to or not. It's a matter of size. And when, as with us, that's the way it works. When you need money for someone, and of course we tend to call them European money, but that's something that we use to hide reality, which means, of course, that Germany has to guarantee for us in front of markets with its AAA. And then you also want to aggressively change the relationship with that government. Of course, that spells trouble. And also with France. So this government's been trying to change things, but I don't think it will, or at least it hasn't changed anything so far.
It doesn't sound like very good strategy to try and go after both Germany and France at the same time.
Exactly.
I would have said that Germany has probably never been weaker, just as a result of the energy crisis and the weak government that is there and the internal divisions with Scholz. I mean, it seems to me like Italy has a golden opportunity here to make common cause with Poland and Spain and everybody else on the periphery and say, like, hey, like, we need to reset things a little bit.
Also France, Jacob, you should ally with France against Germany, so to speak, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I agree with you. And
but that's not happening, I guess.
No, I don't think so. You just mentioned Germany. I really agree with what you said. I think Germany, after Russia, but of course that's self-inflicted. Germany is the real loser of the war in Ukraine, to be very honest. It has to rethink on the short term. Yeah. Now it has to rethink its stance. It has to even its industrial model, totally, completely, and it has to decide what he wants to be as an adult. Of course, you would say we talked about this many times, and this very well. You could say it's long overdue. Germany had to think about this maybe 20 years ago. It wasn't a model, a sustainable model that could be possibly pursued for a long time. Russia is not a neutral country. It's a decaying empire that has got a vision of itself that does not allow any European country to have Russia as a tank or as a gas station, because it's something more complicated than this. And Germany now has to rethink itself, but that's something for them to decide. But I agree. If there was a moment,
I agree with you on the energy component of that. But I mean, so we're recording here on January 11th. This will come out probably in a week or so, maybe a couple of days later. But I mean, one of the things that happened today was the German foreign minister showed up randomly in Ukraine and talked about how Germany wants to support Ukraine's efforts to join the EU eventually, which is why I say in the short term, like, Germany is really going to be one of the countries that suffers the most because of the loss of access to cheap Russian energy. But it seems to me that if Germany can use this to get the EU to start letting in more countries, and even, on a most optimistic basis, getting Ukraine into the European Union, I mean, that's been the entire German model this entire time. Keep expanding outwards, keep getting cheap labor from the East, then sell those products into new markets in either West Africa or wherever else you can. The thing about Putin's blunder in Russia is that if Russia really is that weak, if Ukraine can push back, and Ukraine can't get something like looking like a victory in this war, like they'll have solved Germany's strategic problems going back to the 1870s. This is what Germany's been trying to do for sort of centuries, literally. So I don't know if you see it that way, but do you think Italy would be cool with it?
Yeah. I agree with you on this part when it comes to Germany, but I think that Germany will pay for energy much more than it did until last year, until February last year. That's something that, of course, will have a toll on the German business model. But you're right when you say that getting closer to Ukraine and even maybe getting Ukraine to the European Union, that will work for Germany. I agree. Let's remember that in 2014, when it seemed that Germany had found a sort of a medium way when it got into Ukraine between Russia and the U.S. Back then, Victoria Nuland got very upset just because they thought that Germany wanted to work around the U.S. and of course strike a let's say, I wouldn't say an agreement with Russia, but at least something that looked like it. So you're right
Although
about this.
I will say that, like, not to throw too much shade here, but I mean, I'm pretty sure Victoria Nuland is always upset about something. She never seems to be happy about anything.
No, maybe not, and she's still working for the administration. Of course, there was another administration in the meantime, but now she's gotten back to it. Anyways, you asked, and you're right. You think Italy would be happy with it? To be very honest with you, I don't think we have much saying into this. I think Italy. We tried at the beginning of this war. Italy tried maybe as much as Germany did. We tried to just to work around damage control. We hoped that the whole thing would vanish in a couple of weeks, and business would get back to normal. Then we realized that it wasn't getting back to normal, and we accepted the situation. And now we're trying to rethink, just as much as Germany is trying to do ourselves. But of course, the means that we have are not the means that Germany has. That, of course, will make the situation more complicated for us. But it was too risky, and it was wrong before to be that dependent on Russia and Russian energy. And of course, to change that is correct, but it will take years. And then in the short term, it's just painful. First, we have less means than Germany, and that makes things more complicated. It will get better in the medium term, but in the short term, is painful. It's right and painful.
Well, you have less means than Germany for sure, but you also are in line. I think, is Italy in line to receive the most from the European Union recovery funds, or the second most? I get Italy and Poland switched up there, but I mean, you're supposed to get a big influx, right?
Yeah, Italy is getting the most when it comes to next generation EU fund. Yeah, we're getting the most. The problem is, as of course you know, that it's not getting just one intake. We've gotten a couple of intakes. We're gotten a couple of deposits, and but now it depends on the way we behave, on the way we act. There are some reforms that we're supposed to implement to receive the rest of the money, and that's complicated because we're talking about justice, we're talking about pensions, and with a country such as Italy, with such an elderly population, that's the third rail. That's something that you're not supposed to touch unless you want to die. So I don't know. I did not see any real possibility for reform here, but I might be wrong, and hopefully I am.
Well, that's pessimistic. Why don't we sort of zoom out at a broader level? No, it is, because I mean, I would hope that there would be some prospect for reform, but it also sort of feels, maybe you feel this way, it feels like Draghi was the chance for that reform, and then once Italian politics sort of reverted to its normal, let's replace somebody with a populist like Meloni, that chance sort of sailed.
You might be right about this, but there's something that I do not agree with you on this. Draghi was the right person on that front just because he wasn't elected and he did not want to get reelected because he's not a politician, and is also a person that of course is not that young. So he didn't envision for his future to get reelected. He wanted to become the head of state, as I bet you know. Wanted to become the president of the republic, and he still does, to be fair. So it was the right person, not only because he's skilled, because of course is a very, let's say, experienced, whatever you want, but also because he hadn't gotten elected and didn't want to get reelected. unfortunately, that's a plus. And if you want to get reelected with this electorate, with this public opinion, with this population, it's very complicated to touch pensions. It's very complicated to touch other vested interests that people, even legit interests of the people. And that's why I'm pessimistic. But as I said, I'm hopefully for real. I hope to be wrong. You never know.
Yeah. Well, let's zoom out a little bit. You've already sort of alluded to this, but I wanted to know how you're feeling about the European Union these days as a geopolitical actor. Do you feel like the EU is strengthening? Do you feel like the EU is just doing its sort of normal thing? Do you think the EU is going to help Ukraine? Do you think that the EU is eventually going to make a deal with Russia and sort of get a frozen conflict in Ukraine? How do you see the European Union in the year ahead? Because to me, it looks like quite a pivotal year for the EU.
What do you mean with a crucial year this year for the EU? You know why I asked you, Jacob? Because almost every year is considered a crucial one for the EU. So I'm asking why, particularly this year.
Yeah, well, so I don't say every year is crucial for the EU, but I get that most people say every year is crucial for the EU. But
not you, of course. I've known you for too long to know that. I'm saying in general.
Well, look, it seems to me like the EU's just come off of back-to-back crises. So you had the COVID-19 pandemic, and then you had the Russia-Ukraine war. And in order to get over the energy crisis, and in order for the European Union to sort of punch at the same weight as the United States, as China, you've also got the U.S. industrial policy as a major challenge there, I think, too, to Europe. It seems to me if those two crises don't drive the European Union to real reforms and to real cohesion within the bloc, I don't know what kind of crisis will do it. It seems to me that Europe has to make huge investments in energy infrastructure here over the next year or two and have to really get on the same page politically with all the threats that are surrounding Europe. Because if they don't do it now, they're going to be out of time by the time you get to 25, 26. You've got Turkey rising. You have China, having significant problems this next year or two, but probably emerging stronger after that. You've got Russia, lashing out, I think, out of weakness, but that still poses a threat to Europe. And then the United States being very protectionist. So it just feels like if Europe doesn't do it now, they're never going to do it.
I understand what you're saying, but I think that the interests of the most important European countries are too different to get composed into a union, into a real political union. Let's take Russia. I think we already have the sort of a chat between me and you, but let's take Russia. The way that Spain looks at Russia is very different from the way that Poland looks at Russia, and it's legit. It's even normal. And let's take France. Maybe Spain doesn't really have a vision for Russia, but France does. For France, this war, of course, something very complicated, not only because it's a war, it's on the European soil, it's very close to home, and so forth. But also because, to be very honest, because this war, just the way that the French look at it, this war has brought the U.S. back onto the European continent. Of course, the Americans never left, to be honest, but they were distracted. They looked somewhere else for many years. The Middle East before, the Asia Pacific for the past few years, and now we'll see how long it'll last. But for now, they're back in Europe. That's something that does not make the French happy. When Macron a couple of years ago said that NATO was basically dead, he said so with a smile, to be very honest, because he envisioned the possibility for a European army, for European armed forces, that for a Frenchman, that would mean paid for by the Germans and of course commanded by the French. So for France, Russia has to be a partner in some way. Because if you make Russia not an enemy, Paris thinks that way the U.S. is not needed as much as it is needed now. So France has got this vision for Russia. Russia has to stay inside of Europe, no matter who leads Russia, no matter what they do. Then you have Poland or Romania, or the three small Baltic countries, or I don't know, even we could say even Bulgaria, for example. Those countries, they think that Russia is the enemy, and I can even understand why. And to them, especially for Poland, Russia basically should be defeated, and it would be even better if Russia could be divided with different parts being governed by different entities. And then you have Germany. We talked about this. Germany looks at things just in economical ways or commercial, trade-related ways. But to Germany, would be better if no wars would be waged on the European soil, of course, just as everybody thinks, but also because they want to get back to normal. They want to be able to trade with Russia and to get their energy, whatever they say. So how can you possibly compose those different interests? The only way that you can't now, it's because there's a war. And of course, it's a war of aggression. Russia has invaded another country, and now it's fairly easy to make a stand. But when, and we hope it'll be yesterday, and not even tomorrow, but when this war will end, and hopefully will be now, I think that things will change, and those differences, those different views will get back to the fore, and that they will prevent any strategic agreement. I mean, among those countries, and it's that agreement that would possibly decide the future for the EU, at least to me.
When do you think the war will end?
I don't know. Really don't know. And the fact that I don't know is normal. The fact that the main actors involved in this war, they do not know that either, is more scary. It's never something that makes this war unfathomable to a certain extent. I believe that now the Russians are more inclined to negotiate, not because they were good, not because they realize that war is bad. Of course not. They're the aggressive part here, but because they realized that the longer this war drags on, the worse it can get for them. They could lose more territory than gaining it. So that's the reason why they want to sit at the negotiating table. And I understand anyways that the Ukrainians, that they do not want as much, at least not now, because they're right. They think that they should regain as much as territory as they can before negotiating with Russia. So then that makes the two parts, at least to me, still very far away. And I believe, and then I want to know your opinion on this, I believe that the U.S. would like for them to negotiate. Of course, Washington understands that the Ukrainians are right, and of course, Washington has been helping them, and for crucially, for many, many months with billions and billions of dollars. But I think that Washington understands that we're getting closer and closer to a stalemate, and it would be better to negotiate. But that's my opinion. But as I said, and then we'll get back to you. I'll leave it to your opinion. I believe that the Ukrainians are right. We should definitely get into their shoes, considering what they suffered and whatever we know about this. and they believe that before sitting at the negotiating table, they should be able to regain as much territory as they can.
Yeah, it's hard to. I mean, I guess you have to think about whether the Ukrainians are saying that because they want to keep the pressure on Russia, or if they're saying that and they really mean that they want to push all the way. I don't know that it. I don't know that it looks like a stalemate to me. It seems to me that if the West stopped supplying Ukraine with weapons, that Ukraine would be in a lot of trouble, and that Russia's approach to wars in its history is to grind them out and just endure more suffering than anybody else wants to. I made the mistake of thinking that Russia wasn't going to invade Ukraine because it was going to be bad for Russia to do so. I'm not sure why the calculus would change now, unless they really do think they're sort of in jeopardy of losing. You asked about the United States and what the United States wants here. I don't know if you have this colloquialism in Italy, but the idea that the dog is always chasing its tail. The U.S., when it comes to Russia, sort of like it caught its tail and it doesn't know what to do with it. The United States never expected that Ukraine was going to have this level of success, and it has sort of slowly lumbered into this position where it's the armory for Ukraine's defenders, and it can't pull back arming Ukraine's defenders without basically risking, Ukraine collapsing. At the same time, I think you're right that the U.S. doesn't want to see this go into an all-out war where Putin starts thinking about using nuclear weapons because Ukraine's attacking territory that Russia annexed. But if you also just, read the letter of U.S. foreign policy in both the Biden and Trump administrations, they call Russia a peer competitor. They call Russia a national security threat. You want your national security threats to collapse, right? You don't want them to be strong. So they have a sort of once in a generation opportunity here to make sure that Russia never threatens Europe again. I would think that there are parts of the administration that like that and like where the direction is going.
Consider that we're talking about the U.S. I think that for the long term, I don't know if they do, but I think that especially the security and defense apparatus, they should think of what to do with Russia for the future, considering that China, of course, is the main enemy, and it's not advisable to fight two big enemies at once. Also, of course, Russia is a decaying one, but still is a great enemy, and you're supposed to divide that front, right? Just as the U.S. did in the 70s, in 1972, when, of course, Henry Kissinger flew to Beijing just because he wanted to divide the front. Of course, back then, China was the weaker enemy, and you're supposed to get closer to the weaker enemy just to get that further from the stronger one. So now I think that in Washington, I don't know if they're doing this, but they should think of what to do with Russia for the future, of course. Because I think that Russia would run towards the U.S. if the Americans would, open up to them to a certain extent, of course. Just because the Russians understand how weak they are, and they understand that their situation is not defendable. The way they got themselves into this war is a big mistake. I think that Putin, or maybe not Putin, I don't know, but part of his entourage understands this. And I think that the Americans should know this as well. But I also understand that, as you said, it would be very difficult for the Americans to withdraw now, to say, of course, we tried, we supported Ukraine. And now, even though Ukraine is the part that's been invaded and suffered all that we know, now we make a step back and we want to talk with Russia. I think that's a complicated situation for the Americans as well, and I want to know your take on China on this, because I believe, but I want to know what you think, that China is very happy about the way this war is going. No matter what they say, Chinese and Russians are not allies, not at all. Of course, they have a common enemy. That's the U.S. But being an ally, it's something very different. There are two empires that touch themselves, that know each other very well, and that's been going on for centuries. To Chinese, the Russians are white Europeans that have occupied a huge part of Asia. That's something they should leave. And also considering how long the historical memory is for the Chinese, for them, the Russians have been staying in Siberia and in Asia for such a short time, and they should go somewhere else. Let's also remember that at the beginning of the 20th century, the Japanese, when they had defeated the Russians in 1905, they wanted Siberia from them, and it was the Americans that prevented it from happening. And Teddy Roosevelt even won the Nobel Peace Prize for this. So I think the Chinese are happy because they do not consider the Russians allies or friends, and they see the Russians getting bogged down in such a strategic war for them. But also the Chinese, and then I want to know your opinion, the Chinese are happy because they see the Americans distracted by this war. I don't know what you think about this.
Yeah, there's a couple things to say there. So I think the first, this idea that the United States can play Russia off of China, I don't think that is possible as long as Vladimir Putin is ruling Russia at this point. I don't think the things that Putin has done and the worldview that Putin seems to have, it doesn't seem to me that as long as he's calling the shots, that politically the United States will do it or that Putin would even be open to it. I do think, though, that lends some support to an argument for some kind of replacement of Putin, but most of the Russian regime staying in power and that being part of the negotiation process or something like that. I don't know how that works, and it seems to me like that would be more violent than just kind of moving those pieces around. But I don't think the sort of strategic scenario that you're talking about, I think Putin has taken that off the table for himself. Maybe I'm reading too far into that. As for China, look, I think China thinks of this as two minds. I absolutely agree with you that China and Russia are not natural allies. But China also has to worry here about, it doesn't want a Russian state collapse. It likes having Russia as this, chess piece on the board that also balances against the United States, that also questions the U.S.-led, liberal international order. But at the same time, if Russia continues to try and fight a war and continues getting its butt kicked by Ukraine in real time, and the Russian economy continues to deteriorate, that's really bad for Russia. And if you got the sort of, if you got a sort of Russian Revolution style problem in Russia, or if you got the breakdown of Russia into autonomous, different regions and things like that, like, yes, China would profit maybe from taking over some of those regions itself, but it would lose that other major power that it can align with against the United States, and then you really are in sort of a Cold War between the U.S. and China. I think that's one of the reasons you've seen Chinese officials. It's really happened in the last week. They're telling every single English-speaking newspaper they can, "Oh, Putin didn't tell us about the invasion. Oh, this is kind of crazy." Like, they're starting to sort of distance themselves a little bit from Russia. So I think you're right. There's a sweet spot where China can be happy with this, but the more it looks like Russia is teetering on serious weakness or even state breakdown, I think the more nervous probably China gets, because you say the U.S. is distracted. I don't think the U.S. is that distracted. If anything, like, Ukraine is the perfect U.S. ally. They're doing all the heavy lifting. The U.S. is just sending them weapons, and the U.S. can focus most of its major assets on the Pacific. So,
yeah, that's true. But also the focus seems diverted towards Ukraine. That's the reason why, and you even wrote for us for Domani about this. That's the reason why Nancy Pelosi had to fly to Taiwan last summer, to me at least, just because she wanted to make a statement. They wanted, and she wanted in that case, but when I say they, the Americans first, maybe the White House wasn't even on board, but she or her entourage and parts of the U.S. government, they wanted to state. Especially they wanted to say to the Chinese that they weren't that distracted, that even in the midst of such a war, they were keeping their eyes on Taiwan. But that's, to me, if you feel bound to make such statements because you feel you're distracted. But maybe the U.S. is not, as you said. But I think that the Chinese would definitely pay the ride. They would pay for the Americans to stay in Ukraine or to wage a war even remotely as they've been doing to Russia for many years. Let's remember that when the U.S. incredibly got bogged down in Afghanistan and Iraq, the Chinese paid for the right by buying, U.S. debt, huge chunks of U.S. debt back then. So I don't know. I think the Chinese are happy with U.S. being at least more distracted now than they were a year ago or 2 years ago by the Ukrainian war. And I think you're right when you say that, of course, China wouldn't root for Russia to get divided or to collapse. I agree with you. But Russia to get weaker and weaker for China is not that bad. And also considering that now China could buy Russia's oil for a discounted price. And that's something, of course, I think makes Xi Jinping and his entourage happy, and also the Chinese public. It's a complicated situation for sure.
It is. I wouldn't read anything into Nancy Pelosi's visit about the U.S. I think that was all about Nancy Pelosi.
It was only her doing, you said.
Yeah, I don't think that has anything else to do with the United States. And I mean, the semiconductor restrictions and the acceleration in the trade war that the United States has really presided over since Pelosi's visit, and since you had that little spat between the United States and China over Taiwan, I think tells you that the U.S. is not that distracted. I don't see that Ukraine is sucking up U.S. bandwidth when it comes to China from that perspective. Dario, I know you have to run and I have to run in a couple minutes. I could talk to you for hours, but anything else you want to talk about really briefly before we get out of here? Or anything else that's on the top of your mind? Are you ready to come around to my position that Brazil is a rising superpower, or do you still think Brazil's going to collapse?
Well,
what's on your mind? Considering
that you just mentioned Brazil, and we had a couple of days ago sort of a reenaction of the assault on Capitol Hill. How you looked at this? Did you follow? Of course, I bet you did. Did you follow the crisis in Brazil, and what kind of impression you've had so far? What's your take on it? And it really looked like a reenactment of the assault on Capitol Hill. And also consider that Bolsonaro is right now in the U.S., is in Florida. That's make the whole thing pretty strange, and also an embarrassment maybe for the U.S. administration at this point.
Yeah, well, I mean, we recorded an emergency episode on the Brazil situation here. The spin doctor in me wants to say you should actually read what's happening in Brazil as a positive. The Brazilian military hasn't gotten involved. The people that showed up and were doing this sort of weird January 6th type reenactment, they seem to represent the real radical lunatic fringe of Brazilian society. They're being condemned by Bolsonaro himself and all of Bolsonaro's supporters, and everybody across the Brazilian spectrum is criticizing them, and they've already been cleared from the situation. The place that is more disturbing in Latin America right now is Peru. Again, it's Wednesday, January 11th. This will come out in a week, but I mean, the protests in Peru over the last day or two, I think the death toll is up to 47. I mean, there's a country where you're seeing real state collapse, where you're seeing violence in the streets, and where you're seeing large amounts of the country that are at odds with each other about the country's future. I don't see that with Brazil. I actually see a country that is mostly center-right and would have elected a center-right president if it had been anybody other than Bolsonaro, who just loves saying crazy things, so crazy that he couldn't get, a center-right really majority in the Congress and in the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies. Couldn't get it through. So I don't feel so bad about Brazil. In some sense, I think this is just sort of normal business in Brazil.
Me either. I agree with you. And I happened to be on television during the assault, so I had to comment, right away on this. And I said something very akin to what you just said. That especially when it comes to the military, to the armed forces, considering that. Bolsonaro and also his former vice president, they were very close to the armed forces. If there was a moment for the armed forces to storm those buildings and to make a coup, that was the moment. And the fact that the military didn't take part into this and that didn't move a finger on it, I agree with you. It's a sign of maturity for the Brazilian society and for the Brazilian state. And of course, that wasn't a great spectacle. It looked pretty much as January 6th in the U.S. Maybe better, just because there weren't any debt. And in the U.S., of course, during the assault, there were people that lost their lives. But I think that first, that's not as I said, that's not a great spectacle to watch. But the state apparatus and I would say even the Brazilian democracy, so far at least, they withstood this moment, and that spells actually not that bad for them. It's the situation is not as bad as sometimes it's been portrayed to be.
No, not in the short term. But I will say, like, if you were going to play devil's advocate with me, or when I think about how I might be wrong, thinking about January 6th in the United States, I was always worried that was going to be a moment where people were going to, the seeds of doubt were going to be sown about U.S. electoral institutions. And if you look at polls in the United States, you do see that there's a significant number of people who think that the election was rigged, who think that the political system is a fraud, that the election was not actually free and fair. It seems to be a fairly small number of people in Brazil who bought the same sort of nonsense from Bolsonaro, but Bolsonaro was saying this when he was president. He was saying that the Brazilian election system was rigged and that it was riddled with fraud.
He didn't concede, right?
He eventually authorized the transition of power. He pouted. He did it really reluctantly. Like, he eventually did sort of let the sort of wheels go. But he's been trying to play it and have it both ways. But this is also, and maybe we'll get out of here on this question to you, which is, I wonder if this has something else is going on here in general in the democratic world. Because if we're wrong about Brazil, or if we're wrong about January 6th, I think it's the type of thing that we'll see 5 years from now, and we'll look back and say, oh, this was the moment that people started doubting political institutions. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, because Italy is a place where I feel like people do doubt the political institutions. Meloni was elected in part because she was voicing doubt in those political institutions. So I wonder if there's something going on in the democratic world that, January 6th and this Brazil issue, they're not important issues in and of themselves, but I worry that maybe they're the first signals of a real deterioration of faith in political institutions in the democratic world. But I think it's too early to say that, and I might just be a little paranoid.
You're right. It's very difficult to say now. That's an issue that's been debated for a long time. I think that here in Italy, consider that you mentioned Italy, here people they never really had a great deal of trust in the institutions in general. And but I think you're right. Maybe in the past 20, 30 years, things have gotten even worse. But to be very honest, the institutions have been faring pretty well here. The public opinion doesn't trust them that much. Some people think that the elections are rigged, or maybe if they're not rigged, there's always someone that profits from them, and that's always something that we do not know that happens behind the scenes and so forth. But even so, here democratic institutions they're still standing, and of course that's good news. But you're right, we should get back to this in maybe 5 years, and let's see how things are going in the U.S. and in the rest of the democratic countries around the world.
All right. Well, I've bookmarked. We'll get back to this in 5 years, but I hope you'll come back in a couple months and talk to me about what else is going on in the world.
Whenever you want. So. Always a pleasure. Whenever you want, sure. For real.
And I hope one of these days, Dario, we can do this in person and we can be drinking wine and eating pizza over a podcast. That's like my real dream here.
Hopefully. It's fair to say that you said that maybe in the near future you're flying to Europe. So I'm going back to the U.S. maybe this spring or next summer. So here or there, we'll get back together, and we could have a pizza, whatever you want.
All right. Sounds good. Cheers, Dario. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.